Hi everyone. Okay, we're gonna get started. Thanks so much. Welcome to Format. My name is Shumon Basar. Thank you all for coming to this, the last of the 7th issue. Huge thanks to Peter Carl, who you'll hear more about and more from in a short while. Thanks to everyone, Peter, Manijay, the print studio, everyone who's helped to put all these events together. Very, very grateful. Please turn your phones to silent right now. That'd be great. So Power Format is interested in how power works today. How does it persist? How is it reinventing itself? And does power seek more or less visibility than before? In the last 3 sessions, we've tried to pinpoint power in the art world, in London's planning, in the fashion world, right up to social media influencers. And just a couple of days ago, we looked at the shifts that technology has had on journalism, post-truth making, and politics. So the format of media is indistinguishable from the content of media, as Marshall McLuhan told us back in 1964, and then again in 1967. So the medium of television strides across the 20th and 21st centuries. It powers our politics, our consumer habits, our sex lives, our dreams. And this power is almost immeasurable. And in a sense, it feels like it's always been there. So to paraphrase that famous philosophical cliche, if it didn't happen on television, did it actually happen at all? And yet, what television is today may not be what television was even a decade ago. The noun once referred to both the technology of delivery, so that this thing that often sat in the corner of the living room, organizing all the furniture around it, like a kind of gravitational force. But the word television also refers to content. So there's every chance most of you continue to watch television today, but never on an actual television. It's on your laptop, it's on your phone, on your tablet. So in a way, television manages to outlive television, which in a McLuhan sense proves its inherent power in the face of emerging media that seek to replace television. And here's something. When the Egyptian revolution broke out in Cairo in January 2011. The building that was most heavily guarded by the army wasn't the Ministry of Information. That was left to be pillaged and burned to ashes. The single most protected building was the headquarters of the state TV channels. So just to get a sense of the room, wanted to know which of you here are born after 1990? Okay. And who here has not heard of the TV show Twin Peaks? Tentatively, one person. Okay, that's good. That bodes well. I sincerely hope that the next hour won't only be nostalgic, but we will be going backwards, and also, hopefully, you'll notice we'll be going forwards as well. So, to go back before 1990, American television consisted of programs like this. There were...
Have any of you seen these?
Who's seen the original Baywatch? Yes, good. Which at the time, Baywatch became the most viewed program in the world. Dallas and Dynasty are both based around these kind of warring oil families in Texas. And then Cheers, so Cheers is very important. We'll find out why in the story of Twin Peaks soon, but became one of the great sitcoms in the 80s. And then The Gentleman in the Bottom Left, Frasier went on to have his own TV show in the 90s. So this gives you an idea of the TV landscape in the 1980s. Then on the 8th of May, 1990, on the ABC network, a pilot episode of a new show called Twin Peaks was aired. So Twin Peaks was a collaboration between two protagonists. The first is Mark Frost. And Mark Frost was a kind of television veteran, a writer. Please come in.
Can't go
There's
away.
a seat over there. Sure,
You're
a seat
trapped.
over there. And at this point, he was most famous for this very popular cop show called Hill Street Blues. And he'd been working television for a long time, so it was very, very familiar both with the industry, but also the grammar of television, and this is very important. And then the other person, of course, is David Lynch. And David Lynch studied as an artist, as a painter originally. His dream was to go and study with Oskar Kokoschka, who some of you may know, sort of late expressionist painter. But David Lynch goes all the way to Vienna. By the time he gets there, Kokoschka is no longer there, and he realizes that, in a way, his soul belongs in America, and he goes all the way back and moves to Philadelphia in the late 1960s, and the the role of Philadelphia in the kind of cosmology of symbols and atmosphere becomes very, very important. This sense of a kind of putrefying post-industrial city that's full of pollution, smoke, fog, dirt, grime, and ultimately also a sense of death. There's a way in which he describes Philadelphia at this point as being permanently black and white. So his first two feature films, after he makes a number of short films, particularly as a student, there are two that you can look up. The first is The Alphabet, and the second is The Grandmother. But the film that really, it takes him 5 years, is the one on the left here called Eraserhead, which finally comes out in 1977. It is really a kind of labor of love. At this point, he has very little money, and it's a film. David Lynch films reject boiling down to like it's about X and Y, but if we were forced to do that, it's about this character Henry Spencer, and he gives his partner. He in a way inherits a baby, a child, but the baby is extremely grotesquely deformed and looks barely human, and seems to never sleep, and sort of is both tormented and torments his life. This film becomes an incredible success, mainly because it gets shown on what at that time was called the Midnight Special, which was literally a midnight slot. The word of mouth becomes a kind of cult classic. People are queuing up. And one of the people that sees this film is the film writer, producer, actor, and comedian Mel Brooks. And Mel Brooks describes David Lynch at this point as like Jimmy Stewart from Mars. And he then organizes or allows David Lynch to direct his second feature film, the one here on the right called The Elephant Man, which was based on a stage play, which was based on a historical story about somebody called Joseph Merrick, who is also born extremely deformed. What's the is it elephantitis? Elephantitis, which is a medical condition, again, where you're born in a grotesquely deformed way. Your head his head is about this size, and again, somewhere between a nuclear mushroom cloud and a potato that's been beaten up very, very aggressively. And The Elephant Man is a story about Joseph Merrick being brought into London, in a way, civilized society, but his main function is as a kind of medical specimen. And so, they're set in Victorian era Britain, the time of freak shows. I mean, he's basically saved from a freak show, but then, in a way, enters into a different kind of freak show, which is civilized society. So the impact of Twin Peaks, certainly in the first series, which runs from February 1990 for a number of months, it's a short season. It's only 8 episodes. The surface question seems to be this question of who killed Laura Palmer. We just met Laura Palmer, wrapped up in the plastic sheets on the beach. And so the narrative MacGuffin is the question of who killed Laura Palmer. But in fact, the wonder, the allure, and the kind of, I think the obsessiveness that Twin Peaks elicits has much more to do than simply attempting to answer that question. What we see are the interactions of extremely strange characters. One of the most beloved is here, the log lady. And the log lady receives messages from her log. And then she's like the medium between the log and the world. And importantly, Agent Dale Cooper, who's an FBI agent, who enters into this very small town community to help solve this crime. So we're introduced to this fantastical troupe and it involves everything from small town crime to industrial espionage, potential incest, teenage drama, etc., etc. So the mundane to the sublime. There are hyper-familiar settings, which we'll hear about more in a minute. There are many, many nightmares. What happens is basically surrealism becomes mainstream at this point. And Twin Peaks manages to make the vocabulary of surrealism, of the language of dreams, something that people end up discussing, as they did back then, by the water cooler. This was viral television before viral existing.
Before bottled water.
And before bottled water. But mostly I would say, and this is a word that appears again and again and again in the David Lynch universe, what they create is a mood. And there's a very, very palpable sense of a series, like we pass through mood after mood, and that mood may be sinister, and then it's silly, and then it's absurd, and then it's deeply, deeply disturbing. And that, again, when we hear from Peter, we're going to hear about the different forces and the different kind of materials that are orchestrated to create this succession of moods. So, again, we're 1990s, before the internet, before bottled water, before the internet. But even back then, I have it the other way around, no. Sorry, I'm missing a slide. But if you go back, if we remember the title slide, so the way the font that was used in that opening sequence, every element of the show became a thing. So even that typography, and so there were kind of questions: what type was used? And even that type has become like a beloved and cherished type. As you came in, you were listening to the music. The music is by Angelo Badalamenti, longtime collaborator with David Lynch. Many of those songs, the theme tune "Falling" is sung by Julie Cruz. David Lynch produces the albums by Julie Cruz. So there's a way in which a kind of fan fiction of every single element of this show mushrooms, particularly during the first season, in a way that many people would say had never existed before, and in a way gravitate around a core of ultimate unknowability. It gives rise to what we now think of as puzzle television, right? So things like The Soprano and Lost and almost anything now, these sprawling universes, again, of countless characters, the machinations, their interactions, and often, as in the case of Lost, a sort of almost a metaphysical mystery that is trying to be solved, both by the characters but also by the viewer. We're extremely familiar with this kind of television now, but again, many critics would say it starts with Twin Peaks. Something very interesting happens during the second season. So two things happen. There's great pressure from the network, by the ABC network, to reveal the killer of Laura Palmer. David Lynch was vehemently against this. He said, if you have a goose that lays the golden egg, why kill the goose? But Mark Frost, being more of a TV veteran and perhaps more of a kind of diplomat, sort of conceded. And halfway through second season, I'm not going to tell you in case you haven't watched it, but the killer is revealed. But already, at this point, viewing figures really begin to drop suddenly. The quality of writing also seems to drop, and this has a lot to do with the fact that David Lynch is not involved. I mean, he directs the first and the last episodes of season 2. Mark Frost really takes over in this point. Another thing happens, though, which is that the first Gulf War starts in January 1991. And even according to Mark Frost in an interview, he says that due to the Gulf War, Twin Peaks was moved from its usual time slot for 6 weeks out of 8 in the early 1991, thus preventing the show from maintaining audience interest. I think this is really, really, really super interesting, because what happens in Gulf War I is it's the first time that war, which is becoming increasingly remote, of course, it's about sending cruise missiles from Saudi or Qatari air bases into Baghdad. And CNN broadcasts this live. So it becomes the first live broadcast war. And there's something very interesting, I think, about the fact that Twin Peaks is pushed aside because of a new, well, in a way, the birth of reality television, right? So, and it's interesting that Mark Frost actually attributes part of the failure of the second season to Gulf War I. The second season ends in June 1991. A prequel feature film called Fire Walk with Me is released in 1992. It's booed at the Cannes Film Festival. It's considered it's considered by many critics, and even at the time by the public alike, as something as a sort of an additional commentary to the failure of the series. Although I think that appraisal has been changed very, very recently. But there's a moment in the last few minutes of the last episode in season 2, Laura Palmer appears in the Red Room, and she says these 6 words: "I'll see you again in 25 years." Okay, I'll see you again in 25 years. Now, I just want to go back to something that happened, and something that very important happens in David Lynch's career. After The Elephant Man, so it's hugely successful. It gets 8 Academy Awards. Anthony Hopkins wins an Oscar for his performance. So David Lynch's kind of ascent in cinema firmament is very, 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 very quick. He's given the directorship of adapting one of the great sci-fi epics, Dune. This eventually comes out in 1983, I think, 83, and 83, 84, around then. It's one of the most expensive films at the time, huge special effects. Those of you know the book, it's a very complicated, very dense book that doesn't lend itself to an easy translation to a linear narrative. Again, this film is considered a complete turkey when it comes out. It's panned by the critics. It doesn't make its money back. It was meant to be the new Star Wars, and it's neither that nor 2001 nor any these kind of cerebral science fiction films from the 1970s. It's somehow lost between. One of the other reasons David Lynch would say is that he doesn't have, because of the scale of this film, again, those of you know, when you're working within the studio system, you don't have final cut. And as the producers got more and more worried and scared and panicked, and this is what happens, that the more that they interfere. So a voiceover is added to the final cut, and they basically butcher it. He makes I think a 3-hour initial cut. They cut it down to 2 hours. Anyway, it completely flops. The producer at this point is a very famous producer called Dino De Laurentiis. Dino De Laurentiis has a 2-picture deal with David Lynch. So he's somehow obliged to make another film with Lynch, but he doesn't really want to. He's lost a lot of money. And David Lynch has got another project in mind. He tells De Laurentiis, it's going to cost around $10 million. De Laurentiis says, I can't spend that much money. And David Lynch says, well, okay, if you don't have to pay my fee, but you've got to give me final cut. And have nothing and De Laurentiis at this point really just kind of wants this to go away, wants to just sort of do the minimal amount of contractual obligation. So he says, okay, fine. David Lynch then makes this extraordinary film, Blue Velvet, which comes out in 1986. And it couldn't be more different to Dune. He makes it for $6 million. It's a film set in a quintessential suburban town. And again, it's about the malevolent dark forces behind picket fences and suburban house fronts. But what I want to stress here is that what Lynch realizes at this point is that he has to have, in order to make the world that he needs to make, he has to have complete creative control. And so what that means is, from this point on, the films are made for relatively small budgets, which means he doesn't have to raise so much money, which means he doesn't need huge producers who come in and interfere, but he will have final cut. But it means that he also gets to do the sound design and everything. They're Gesamtkunstwerks, and this is very, very important for him. So, this May, 21st of May, Twin Peaks came back 26 years after the final episode, but 25 years after Fire Walk with Me. It starts with a 2-hour episode. We're now, there are 18 altogether. We're now 9 episodes through, exactly halfway. And in 2006, David Lynch made his last feature film, which is called Inland Empire. Some of you may have seen it. And after that, he vows that he'll never make another feature film again. But he and Mark Frost say yes to Twin Peaks. And one thing that David Lynch describes this season, the third season of Twin Peaks, as an 18-hour-long feature film that happens to be cut up into 18-hour-long episodes and that are broadcast over that long period of time. And that's also very interesting. Again, those of you who watch a lot of Netflix today will know that the way that the model is moving much more is to basically dump a whole series at once, following the kind of binge viewing model that we've developed after box sets, right? So, but they have insisted on this like old-fashioned traditional phasing, right? One episode a week, and it's not exactly 18 weeks, but pretty much. And so those of us who were expecting easy nostalgia would have been completely disappointed. It's an entirely different world, and also the same world, to the first Twin Peaks. Whereas Twin Peaks stuck very, very carefully to that one small town location and explored it in kind of almost insane and hysterical levels of detail and depth. We now have many, many locations across America, New York, Las Vegas, and many other places whose names are much harder to use. There's no single plot really to solve. There's no kind of single MacGuffin like Who Killed Laura Palmer. It's a constellation of fragments that seems to unfold through a kind of aleatoric logic that is its own logic and is much, much harder to discern in terms of why we move from one scene to the next. Which is a point that my friend Charles Arsène Henry says, is that there's a sense in which there's almost complete randomness of one scene moving to the next. We could literally go anywhere, and increasingly almost any time as well. And this is very unusual for television. And I don't want to give too much plot away, although I don't even know how I would give the plot away. But I think one of the very, very interesting and palpable textures of this new Twin Peaks is our experience of time in it, our experience of emptiness, silence, and of course, mortality. So we'll have someone smoke a cigarette, and the scene will last exactly the time that cigarette needs to be smoked in real time. We will see someone sweep the floor of a bar in real time, which, again, if those of you know your film history, goes back to something like Ozu, a sense of real time in cinema. But nothing else happens, right? We watch a man sweep a floor for 4 to 5 minutes. And so there's a sense of time, and there's a sense of also like a filled emptiness, and in a way the glass cube above, I think, is a really good example of this. I mean, this is a scene where the boy on the left here, student, he's being paid money by someone he doesn't necessarily know to watch this glass cube, which is being recorded by 2 cameras, you can see at the side, and then every so often, the memory card will be filled. He will have to go to the cameras, take that memory card out, put a new one in, and file those memory cards, and that's all he does. And he's visited by this woman, and again, extraordinary amount of emptiness. But of course, it's an emptiness full of potential and full of promise. But because of this format of a film that's taking 18 hours to take place, we have to be patient. And we have to be patient in a way that would test the average television viewer's patience in the early 21st century. And so, we get to episode 8. And in internet parlance, episode 8 broke the internet. Again, it's very hard to to tell you what happens in episode 8. We've gone into the mushroom cloud of the Manhattan Project, which is, of course, the first test detonation of the first nuclear bomb. And then we're into what? We're into like the sort of, those of you know the history of flicker cinema, Stan Brakhage, there's a sort of history of cinema where instead of filming anything, people would just like scratch or kind of attack the film material itself. We're also into I think what I think is the most legitimate heir to the end of 2001, the Stargate in 2001, which is also another one of the great examples of a kind of almost a hallucinogenic time travel, abstracted flicker experience. But here we're inside a mushroom cloud, right? And so, I mean, to me anyway, there's never been mainstream television that's been as abstract as this, and I can't imagine there ever will be again. So the thing is, it feels like that Twin Peaks basically reinvented television twice. It did it once in 1990 on its own terms, and it's doing it again now in 2017, and with a quarter of a century or so between the two. And so, but how does it do this? Well, it goes back to, I think, that story between, or the lesson that Lynch learns between Dune and Blue Velvet, where he has to ensure the conditions in which this complete vision can be executed and then expressed without any external kind of interruption. And I think it's astonishing that a TV network like Showtime has given this. About a year or so before broadcast, David Lynch apparently walked off set, threatened to leave the project, partly over fees, but I think also partly over the question of complete artistic control. So, I mean, the story here, of course, is that every great work often requires that great client, right? So, and whether that's in architecture, in publishing, in cinema, and here in television. Back in the 70s, the time when he was making Eraserhead, I mean, he was kind of neurotic person, and he would often wear 3 ties at the same time. And then later on, someone said, and then he stopped wearing the ties. And I met him a couple of years ago, and it was this always a shirt, the top button done. And someone asked him why. He says, "I don't like wind on my collarbone." I don't like wind on my collarbone. He finds it very disturbing. So remember the eye of the duck, and the duck as a kind of compositional lesson for aesthetics. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Peter Carl. But it's very hard for me, actually, to introduce Peter Carl, such as the impact he's had not only on my own thinking life, but countless others who've studied with him. From Kentucky to the AA, to Cambridge, to London Metropolitan University, and more recently, Harvard. He's a scholar of James Joyce, Le Corbusier, Heidegger, Gadamer, you name it. Video games, Roman antiquity. His commitment to architecture as the deep interconnectedness between things is really unparalleled. When we met first when I was 17 years old. It was a very, very long time ago. And I was being interviewed by Peter to see if he'd accept me in the Department of Architecture at Cambridge University. I brought my A1 portfolio in. It was covered with cutouts of pictures that I liked at the time, things that promised a future world that I didn't belong to up till that point. One of these images was that picture of Jack Nance from Eraserhead. And so instead of sort of starting out on the subject of architecture, Peter took note of this picture, asked me about it, and so the very, very conversation we ever had was about David Lynch. This conversation has never ended, and so now it gives me great pleasure to have you listen into some of these thoughts now about the interior powers of Twin Peaks. So will you please join in welcoming Peter Carl?
Well, thanks very much. A very generous introduction. And you are one of the very few students I remember interviewing. Shumon asked me to talk for about 15 minutes. And what I wanted to do was start a bunch of little conversations that we could pick up later and explore depending on how you're coming at this. But I also wanted to look at it from the point of view, why care as an architect? I mean, there's all sorts of interesting things to say about Twin Peaks, but I think there's, when an awful lot of architecture is literally lost in space or space and form, Lynch animates the deeper context. And if there's anything to do with power, it has to do with how those deeper contexts are animated. And I wanted to just pick off a few bits. As I say, one could go on forever. And one of the bits, and Shumon already called out Lucy's specification of the furniture against the wall, is this little configuration. At the upper slide, you see an installation that I actually think started at the Cartier and then went on to Brühl, called The Air is on Fire. And you see him standing between a sofa and a chair. And the background is little bits of fire in the sky, and these great doorways lead to a kind of gilded nature. And we'll come back to this problem. I mean, he was talking in a little clip that Shumon showed about nature teaches many things, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But here from Lost Highway is the cabin that is in the final scenes, isolated on stilts, actually, on the beach, with that same configuration. And similarly, in the Red Room, you've got these, which is this, it's funny because there's an awful lot of Lynch that is high production, but looks like it was done for the Sunday school. It's just curtains and a floor and some furniture and slightly kitsch lighting. And it's the precision with which it's positioned between something that's had an immense amount of thought and is full of references, and something that just seems to be, okay, guys, throw out some curtains, drop some lights behind it, and in the most recent incarnations of the Red Room, those lights aren't there. Go with it. And it's that, the little lamp next to Dale, by Dale's right arm. Can I point? Yes, I can. This is a planet that was originally commissioned for the 1939 New York World's Fair. And one of the quite what the waiting room is, we'll come back to and then won't answer because it's best left open. Sorry, the Red Room. But one of the things it's called is the waiting room. And from episode 9 of the most recent incarnation is this waiting room to the morgue. And in fact, this is Diane, to whom Dale is talking all during the early episodes of Twin Peaks, and whom you don't meet. And she's sitting against this blank wall with, again, this configuration of furniture. It's as if it anticipates people, as if something's talking already before people show up. And yet there is that separation, and there's a game that's constantly played through his interiors with these little tables and chairs that sort of go with each other and don't go with each other, and we'll look at a couple more. But she has a wonderful one-liner in this. There's a whole thing in the latest episode, the latest series, about smoking and not smoking. And she lights up in this waiting room, which is announced by Lynch as the lead investigator as, here's the waiting room, as he, it's the way he delivers the weather report on his website. And he tells her that she can't smoke, and she says, it's a fucking morgue. What can go wrong? And the degree to which the Red Room is connected with death, is connected with memories, and quite what these other levels are that are constantly in play with Lynch is a bit like what's going on between the two little bits of furniture that have their own kind of monumentality. Here is two more examples. One from Fire Walk with Me, very rare aerial shot. This is Donna's living room. Interestingly, Twin Peaks was originally shown on, primetime TV by ABC. There were only 3 networks at that point. So as Shumon was saying, everybody's sitting around watching their lives turn inside out for an hour. But curiously, you don't see that setting in Twin Peaks. What you get is this, with a fireplace, these comfy seats, tables. Here Donna and Laura are talking about Laura's boyfriends and good and evil and so on and so forth. And down below is again Diane, a very rare flat in the Twin Peaks universe, set in the 50s, and it's urban, i.e. the setup shot, the establishing shot seems to be New York, like in the Village, brownstones. But it's all these funny little primary shapes, little ovals and objects. And whoops, I'm showing this one because in the I'll skip my arrow. Because in the beginning of this sequence, there is no cigarettes on the table. And by the time the 2 detectives, that's of course Lynch and Albert, sit down, a pack of cigarettes and a lighter mysteriously show up. But you've again got the sofa and the 2 chairs, a little dining scene, and a funny little Orientalist shrine. And it's set up it's a much more fragile space. It's not the kind of deep, heavy backgrounds that you're used to working with in Twin Peaks. It's possibly because it's urban, possibly because it's series 3. One of the more interesting variations on this is the so-called room above the convenience store, which is again connected to the Black Lodge and to the Red Room. And I have put the gomonbosia there because I can never remember that word. But that is all the stuff in those plates in the foreground. And it's creamed corn. And this seems to be the food of the people who live in this dark, evil world. It's after death, and people can be possessed, but you see the sofa is up against the wall, and there's other funny little bits of furniture. There's a little leaping man who becomes the arm, which is this twig with a head on it that turns up for Dougie Joe, it doesn't matter, which is the missing arm of Mike, who is now the inhabitant of the Red Room. But anybody who's been touched by this evil world has something to say about creamed corn, or throws it up, or eats it. And the 2, certainly for Twin Peaks, the 2 primary characters are Bob on the right, and the man from another place, who didn't make it into Twin Peaks 3. And you see they're sitting on these very fragile chairs with this very prominent Formica table that's been kind of exported from all the diners and restaurants. And we'll come back to those kinds of transitional worlds in a moment. It's certainly not the convenience store that is in episode 8, because that has nothing above the roof. It's quite possibly that it's in Buenos Aires, which is where Philip Jeffries, what's his name, that singer?
David Bowie.
Yeah, played by David Bowie, came from. And he is a regular presence, or regular absence. And this is obviously much more animated by Edward Hopper and that sort of world. Now, these are Lynch's houses on Sonalda Road, which is a road just below Mulholland Drive in northern Los Angeles. And it comprises 3 houses. The one on the left is a kind of studio. The one in the middle runs Asymmetric Productions, which is his production company. And he lives in the one on the right, which is a late house by Frank Lloyd Wright's son, Lloyd Wright, that is as laconic as you can get. You know, it is 2 parallel bands of concrete with a running down the middle, and he says he loves it. But you see it's embedded in this kind of Twin Peaks-like world of rocks and trees. And the house on the left was used as Fred Madison's house in Lost Highway. You see it from the front, and then you see it from the inside. And that skylight, the detective is in the skylight. And the thing seems to have been, if you can see at the bottom, I don't know if you can see because we've got such bright lights, but the couch, the bent couch that just peels away from the wall is the same couch that's on the left, but the wall color has changed and the table has changed. And this capacity for this sort of primordial setting, you can see everything is pushed against the wall. It's a kind of room where people are stranded against the pieces of kit or furniture that happen against these colored walls. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But it's that capacity to subtly work with the background leaves you constantly worrying about the furniture, worrying about what the ashtray is, worrying about the color of the walls, everything that you take for granted. I mean, a standard sitcom is a bunch of people sitting on a sofa looking at you, and he's taken that, broken it apart, and made it this theater where the most horrible things can happen. These are 2 drawings by Lynch and some comments about architecture that can be put against what Shumon showed about nature. The top one, I don't know if you can read it, is called Modern House, and the bottom one's called House on a Hill. And you don't know whether the hill is that thing in the foreground, you know, where a nipple is the house, or quite what I'm dealing with, a belly button. And that black cloud, both inside, outside. At any rate, he thinks architecture is something always to think about, and his heroes are all heroes of early modernism, and particularly as they got exported to California, people like Schindler and Neutra. But he also claims to dream about furniture. So the living room in Twin Peaks, do you remember the frequency with which the name showed up in the title sequence that Shumon showed? In between 2 of those titles, this appears in segment 3, in episode 3, and it's the whole story of what's going to happen in Twin Peaks in this little flash, and it's all set in the living room. René Taube did a little essay on this and drew a plan. I thought it would be interesting to see how an architect sees this and how you see it. But I won't go through the whole sequence, but what roughly is happening is Laura Palmer's mother, who's sitting on the sofa next to Andy, has had a vision of Bob, and he's recreating Bob as a drawing. That is Maddie, who, on the far left, who is the dark-haired reincarnation of Laura. And this thing is shot from where she will eventually die. I'll come back to this, but just remember that there is a picture of Missoula, Montana, just off screen to the left above this shell thing. And you see there's a kind of Senefrons in the back. This is a very deep living room with a kind of extra room behind the sofa that's got a screen and a plant. Again, I'll talk about the plant in a moment. Coming from behind that is Leland, her father, in his pajamas. And I probably don't need to go any further, but it's like, and Donna is Laura's best friend. That was the one who was lying on the sofa we saw before. And you go out that door on the right, and you go up this stair, which may have been taken from Hitchcock's Psycho, but it could also be, Freud has an immense amount to say about stairs and sexual violation or just sexual life. And that's Laura's room, lit up there. There is behind the screen a record player, and on the ceiling of the stair is this fan. And these kind of mechanical, rotating, cyclical pieces seem to be related to this kind of violation. And as I was saying, what's going on behind the sofa, what goes on in the gaps between things like beds and walls. In the bed gap in Lost Highway, he moves slightly to the right of the bed, and it's this great chamber opens, and you're off into another world. There's a couple of beautiful scenes in the most recent incarnation of Twin Peaks 3, where you're looking at a kind of L-shaped room, and you don't know what's on the other side of the L. It's all happening in front of you, but they're alluding to what's going on around the corner. And this capacity to, as I say, activate the background, the stuff you kind of take for granted, and make it promising, threatening, curious, is an essential aspect of how his rooms work. And there are three critical rooms in Twin Peaks: the Palmer living room, the Roadhouse, and that's Julie Cruz singing. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do people know Twin Peaks enough so they all know what I'm talking about when I say the Roadhouse? Right. And the Red Room. And they communicate with each other. I mean, I've got them vertically. It may be that the Red Room is afterlife, beyond life, but these places like restaurants, the Roadhouse, the Great Northern Hotel, which is this wonderful mixture of Logier's Primitive Hut and Northwest Indian creatures with a skylight, or One-Eyed Jack's, which is another hotel where people from Canada come down and are entertained by women trying to make some extra money tying cherry stems with their tongue and this kind of thing. But the red curtain, for example, seems to be associated with sexual violation or sexual activity with a kind of threat to it. So these recurring elements will again show up in these otherwise innocent rooms. Okay. Lastly, I just want to go through a couple of themes that you might want to play with in your spare time. The kind of universe of references of Twin Peaks veers between, on the one hand, a kind of nostalgia, and I don't know how people from Europe get this, because it is very specifically American. And America just doesn't have a history. And it was interesting, when he went to Poland for the segments of Inland Empire, he just silenced all that stuff as if it was in California. I mean, the deep background he could have drawn on. I mean, what Catholicism is in Poland is just, you would think, a four-course meal for David Lynch, and he just omitted it entirely. Complete mystery to me. But at any rate, this is the world in which, strong people do good, and the food is hearty, and people are friendly and they help each other. And on the other hand, this is the petroglyph from the Owl Cave, which is another site that's linked to the Red Room, transposed to a blackboard so that people can analyze it. And the emphasis here is on a whole series of Native American myths. What you've got at that little circle of trees with the section beside it with a kind of what looks like ice cream on top is how you communicate with this other world, with the Red Room. It's actually There's 11 drawn, but it's 12 sycamore trees. Directly above it seems to be Mrs. Thrimmond and her grandson. You can see Twin Peaks with a waterfall and a fire next to it. I'm not quite sure who the 7 wise people are, who 4 of whom are connected to heaven by wires. The little circles are the planets, so it's not a constellation. The thing at the bottom is a man-eating owl and the sun and the moon. Now, he is playing not only with Native American references, but with the kind of alchemical and mythic references that were being worked by the generation of architects and painters that he was looking at, i.e. from the first half of the 20th century, which if you're interested in Pierre Mabile's book on myth and Kurt Seligman's history of magic are the sources for those. I mean, they're taken from many other sources, but that gives you the kind of ways in which they were thinking this mythical inheritance precisely. I mean, it's all dead now. I mean, Le Corbusier and Kahn were the last architects to work like this. And that's the generation that Lynch is part of. Okay, so just with that very broad play of references, I have below a shot of Dale and Sheriff Truman, Harry S., who was the father of Wally. No, not the father of Wally, skip it. They've got donuts and coffee in front of them. All through Twin Peaks are multiple allusions. Donald Sutherland's son, what's his name?
Kiefer.
Kiefer in Fire Walk with Me says that, look, they're all drugs. Caffeine, cigarettes, sugar, but it goes off into women. It goes off into people's little obsessive habits. And these ways of kind of capturing pleasure are coupled to a much more complex story. On the one hand, there is nature. This is the Pacific Northwest, you know, at the time that Starbucks is coming out. You can't get it more healthy and happy, you know, with funny little logos. I mean, there's a green ring that looks vaguely like the Starbucks logo that is an owl with Twin Peaks or horned or whatever. That is part of the link to the Red Room and so forth. But this is Laura Palmer's house, which I learned recently is not a set, but was actually sold on the market, not for very much money, it happens. But you see, it's completely shrouded in good growies. And that room that we were looking at, you see the projection on the right. That room is the whole depth of that house. And Laura's bedroom is the upper left window through which Bob comes to threaten her at night. Other examples of this nature, you see it's supposed to be good. And so now we're making a link to things like donuts and healthy and hearty and good old Twin Peaks. But it's where all the evil comes from. It's where the drugs are done. It's where people are murdered. It's the access to the owl cave, to the Red Room. It's where the aliens come. Bob is like a wolf man. It goes on and on. And so when you'll see all the pictures that are hung in Laura's house are pictures of nature. You know, so it's all these plants, and one of them is a shot of this elk that when Maddie is pushed against it, it becomes a bird in a nest, perhaps a dead bird in a nest. And he says to her, go back to Missoula, which is where Lynch was originally from. So you've got, and then in the lower left, from Fire Walk with Me, is this world that's completely papered in flowers. We would probably think in terms of Morris wallpaper, but also the dining room where Leland tortures Laura in the morning, "How are you doing, sweetie?" I mean, it's really scary stuff. No, I mean, dead creepy. And she hangs this picture, she gets it from, remember I mentioned Mrs. Tremond and her grandson. She gets this picture from the grandson, puts it on a wall, and has a dream that goes into this, through this room, to the Red Room. So it becomes another one of the ways of communicating with the Red Room. These kind of things can become like the little rebus that you see in the lower right, where the muskox, white with black eyes and black nose, is cradling the instrument of its destruction, like the telephone cradles the speaker piece with a white nose, and that speaker on the wall. And you know, they kind of resonate with each other. You know, it's hilarious, but also slightly scary. It's very, that borderline between insane, violent, just pleasant is what's going on in a lot of Lynch. Okay, one of the things he's playing with is a topic that was very popular at the time, a kind of semiotic reading of objects of desire, and how they could make worlds. And Baudrillard's system of objects has a lot, I mean, it's unfortunately, it looks more interesting than it is ultimately, but it alights the topic of reading a room separately. And you know, how do you read it? What is the distance between things? What happens in that distance between things? To that, what Lynch has done is coupled it to a kind of semiotic reading of American suburbia that's linked to the market. So if you're market category C, you'll all be buying the same sofa, the same curtains, the same coffee pot. And this business of the house in the country is like one of these grand themes. I've just got 4 of them. That's Barrett's in the upper right, somewhere in Cambridgeshire. That in turn is coupled to the kind of thing that you may know from Roland Barthes, the Système de la Mode, where he's divided American clothing between what he calls work and leisure, but as you go down that chain on the left, you see it includes ceremony, rites, theater, i.e., you know, it's interesting how many architects dress in black, despite the fact that you can dress any way you please, that people adopt these kind of, you know, some of them are quite utilitarian, but the business of wearing blue jeans or dungarees in Twin Peaks is terribly, you know, indicative, or the kind of boots you have. That, you know, whether you've got, you know, the kind of ceramic ashtray you have. So all of this stuff is caught up between the supposedly, you know, neutral, you know, neoliberalist market on the one hand, and cultural readings. And are they moments of estrangement? Are they moments of identity? Are the moments of identity precisely the moments of estrangement? Because what you find over and over again in Lynch is the objects of desire that are, you know, this is the way I want my house. This is the way I want my girlfriend or lover. This is the way I want my car, is precisely what attracts the evil that this vision of goodness leaves out. And so the evil is always riding just behind what seemed to be desirable, good, pretty, and all of that. In turn, it addresses a much wider topic, which I'm only referencing in one slide because I don't want to get lost in it. We can if we want to. That's been going on since probably the 80s, about trying to understand the background. I mean, once in Heidegger, you get rid of perception of, and you start speaking of claim of, or involvement with, i.e. the deep background gets activated as a topic, and all sorts of people, and from anthropology, ecology, have gone off trying to figure out what this is about. And we could go on and on. ANT, you may have heard of, is one of the early efforts to understand this, actor network theory. If you're interested, we go, I think it's pretty much a dead duck. But it was, again, just to indicate, it still comes up again and again. One of these attempts to understand what it is that we have in play and the tension between sort of sociological or anthropological research and the detective who becomes a key figure in the late, probably after Sherlock Holmes, where, as Moretti says, Sherlock Holmes himself sort of treats everybody with amusement. He kind of researches, human foibles. But the corollary of that is that the cultural universe is the most effective means of policing. And of course, when you start being online and you're just always evidence, you've kind of gotten lost in that world, instantly. What Lynch works with is something more like this. Cabaret comes out of fusing theater with restaurant, i.e. they're typical situations that have a kind of decorum and a scale that allow you to combine them. And so you can see him using over and over again these chairs and tables to negotiate all kinds of conflicts and reconciliations. And he's working with a much more, it's very difficult to do that kind of thing scientifically. It's much more metaphoric. It's like architectural metaphor, which of course he's getting out of surrealism. These are all from Max Ernst. The one on the bottom was painted into a page. The title on it is "This is my bedroom. I painted it in one night." He basically painted, it was a page from an encyclopedia for children, and that there was land animals and sea animals, and he just painted out everything but the things in the background and things in the foreground, added a bed and a table and a closet that's growing on a tree, and that way, and yet once you know that it's come from a kind of encyclopedia, this kind of world of just names and the proper room, the tension between things that just float as names and a room and a place that is itself estranging, that's your home, is the kind of world that Lynch is working with. I mean, his metaphors are different than Ernst's. This is appliances on legs, and the sequence that Shumon just showed you shows you the degree to which a barbecue and a TV really have a lot in common. But it's also the background to rooms like this that are clearly staged. I mean, that woman, I don't quite understand her role, but she's sitting on a sloping sofa, like a piece of landscape. And the ground is like huge pieces of marble that are then projected up through that wavy screen to the oculus. Where she's sitting is a hand crank, and in front of her is electricity, a huge insulator, and a lamp that's trying to look like a plant. If you see this, you'll see what electricity means. And this world permeated by its blinking lights are, a real warning in any Lynch to a kind of evil that will about to happen. And lastly, this is from the very first series. This is Bobby barking like a dog when he's in prison. You spend a lot of time in people's orifices in Lynch, and people yelling at you or screaming or just about to throw up, under fingernails where you may get the initials of Robert. This Bobby was always to me a kind of young Bob, who is the evil figure. I mean, he's always running around in leather, and he's, doing 50 lines of coke an hour, and he carries a gun, and he's dangerous, and he's always in the woods. And in Twin Peaks 3, he's grown up, and he's loved by his dad, and he's on the police force. I fear for Bobby. I think Bobby is going to go down the tubes by the end of TP3. Okay, that's all. I just wanted to start a couple of conversations and whatever people want to talk about.
Thank you. If you have any questions, please put your hand up in a minute. I just have one question with you. You showed that the Ernst painting of the room with the kind of tricksy perspective. How much of because I mentioned earlier that in a sense Twin Peaks manages to mainstream surrealism, and
I think that's a fair point. Yes, I think that's a very fair point. And Lynch has kind of two speeds of drawing or painting. One is like those, they're almost outsider art, TV, barbecue, and all you need is letters. You don't even need television, barbecue, and you don't need people around it. They're like two people angry at each other, like two chairs sitting there, no table. And then there's a lot of paintings that require a huge amount of work, that are kind of color field paintings. And in between are drawings, that exhibition I showed at the very beginning from Goul, and originally the Cartier Foundation, came out of a drawing. And you can see him, sorry, I realize color field isn't right. It's much more the world of smoke and rot. He's perfectly capable of putting a piece of meat on a painting and letting the bugs eat it. And, that's what the painting does. What he doesn't do is cubism or, Mondrian or any of that sort of thing. The stuff is always kind of got a hand in it, or it's a place. And, it's marked, somebody's left behind, or it's, like the barbecue. It's sort of somewhere between a diagram and a setting. And to that extent, it's like surrealism in that it implies a narrative. It implies that something happened. You may not be able to say quite what it was or what's in conflict. It's never as literal as somebody like Dali. It's much more like the Ernst, where you have things in play that, they relate to each other, but if you try to write it all down, it's going to be too many words, and it's, you've kind of blown it. You should have left it alone as an image. But it's that business of activating the background that's so potent. And it's, very hard to do. Your force screen in CAD is a 16th century invention. This, i.e., it means that all architecture is essentially visual. And it's just, everything that would make it dramatic, or a place, or a building, has to be supplied. You get done with a lump, and you don't know whether it's a bollard, a marital aid, or a skyscraper. You've got to fill all that in, and some people like that ambiguity, but as form and space, it makes everything, it requires that everything has to be supplied. The whole business of what's a topic, who's there, why to care, all that has to be added to it. If you look at the way people, for some reason architects, or the architects I've gotten who are very digital, tend to do only digital. They like a clean world, and it all happens in the code, it all happens in the animations. But if you go to something like a games studio, the laptop will be covered with clay and paint, and there's clay models, and there's plastic models, and there's stuff that's hand-drawn, and there's stuff that's growing up in, all the visualization software that i.e. It's not so desperately clean and cool and space. It's a much more messy world and can go wrong and is vulnerable. And that's quite important to the kind of quality. We tend to make models. There's a whole other story that you can say about architecture that comes out of Adolf Appia. This world that is both matter and light simultaneously. That's why all our models are that. Sorry, I'm not going to get on that.
Are there, any questions or comments? Maddie, please. Yeah.
What's very interesting to me is the emptiness, which is a threat. Mm-hmm. And anything can happen in emptiness. And when there's fullness, there's nothing can happen because it's already done. It's past. So what is interesting about Lynch also that things happen accidentally, and he likes to just embrace those things. So Bob was a guy who was just a guy who just happened
furniture,
to all the time jump into this scene, And they said, okay, we just have to write him into the thing. And so he became, grew a bigger figure. Every time he got more, although he started out as nothing. He was just somebody who would do the waste baskets or something. I don't know what he did.
Yeah, and he seems to have died of AIDS about 8 years later. No, I mean, there's a whole thing about the last series, about how all these original figures have grown old. And it's like a new kind of distance. And all those themes of death and the difference between aging and getting murdered, or killing yourself by, drinking yourself to death, or, going off to one-eyed jacks or something like that. And that age is a really interesting and palpable phenomenon, because the other one was so full of young people, and they're all kind of erotic and kind of working off each other. And this thing has a very different kind of energy, and it's people's memories become fused with American history. I mean, 25 years, and the country's only, 240 years old, something like that? I mean, so they've lived, a quarter, or a third the age of the country, and so they're kind of gripping for things to hang on to. And, this business of typical situations, you get two people talking to each other, and Lynch, the way they talk to each other, you can't leave out the background. I mean, it's impossible to watch Twin Peaks once. You've got to watch it twice, because everything's going on in the background. And the plot is a vehicle for the background. It's not about who loves who.
Thank you.
It's the space between anything can happen and then everything happens. And that space.
But it's interesting how he uses, in the most recent one, he's using a lot more of these, what Rembrandt called junk space. Just bays, structural bays that somebody has ornamented with aluminum lettering and a bunch of desks. And the way you kind of wander in that, or, the guy carries 2 tiers of huge coffee cups through it, trying to guide Dougie, who is, looking for orientation in any number of ways. And these kind of plazas with bits of art out of them. He's really figured out how to use the estrangement of that as something that, has a positive character. It isn't just, what it looks like in Rhino or, AutoCAD.
Okay, guys, we've come to the end of today's format and our format 2017. I want to thank you all, especially those of you who've come again and again, those of you who stayed on. Thank you very, very much. So for the last time, will you join me in thanking Peter Carl, and a round of applause for yourself. Thanks very much.